By the time the sun climbed over the stony shoulder of Isandlwana, the British camp still looked like the camp of men who believed history belonged to them. White tents stood open beneath the great lion-shaped hill. Red coats moved through the dust with the calm of empire, and rifles leaned in ordered rows as if order itself were armor. Then the ground began to move, and the myth of invincibility that had crossed oceans under the Union Jack was suddenly surrounded by 20,000 Zulu warriors coming out of the earth like judgment. To understand why that day exploded with such force, you have to begin with a king who did not dream of conquering the world, only of keeping it away from his gates. Cetshwayo kaMpande, king of the Zulu, ruled a powerful African kingdom built on discipline, kinship, age regiments, and a military tradition that had once shaken southern Africa under Shaka. He was not a fantasy carved by European fear, not a wild tyrant thirsting for British blood, but a ruler balancing pride, caution, and the burden of a nation trapped beside an empire that had learned to call hunger civilization. He knew the British were dangerous. He also knew that once they decided his kingdom was an obstacle, every effort to avoid war might still end in war. The British Empire did not march into Zululand because it had been attacked. It marched because men in colonial office believed the independent Zulu kingdom was too strong to be allowed to remain. Sir Bartle Frere, the British High Commissioner in southern Africa, pushed forward an ultimatum so harsh it was never meant to be accepted. It demanded that the Zulu dismantle parts of their military system and submit to foreign control. It was an order disguised as diplomacy. When the deadline passed in January of 1879, British columns crossed the border. The war had begun before the Zulu king had truly chosen it. On paper, the invasion seemed almost insulting in its confidence. British officers had fought in colonial wars across continents. Their soldiers carried Martini Henry rifles, modern firearms with terrifying stopping power. They had artillery, rockets, drill, the machinery of an industrial empire. Against them stood an army that most of Britain preferred to imagine as primitive, armed largely with spears and cowhide shields, terrifying in numbers perhaps, but doomed in the face of firepower. This was the arrogance at the center of the invasion. The British saw the Zulu military system as something old. They did not understand that old does not mean weak, and that discipline can wear sandals as easily as boots. The Zulu army that gathered against them was not a mob. It was an impi, a national fighting force shaped by obedience, endurance, and collective movement. Men marched barefoot over punishing ground at astonishing speed. Regiments were organized by age and identity, bound by loyalty to king and comrades, trained to close quickly and kill at close range. Their classic battle formation was remembered as the horns of the buffalo, the chest to pin the enemy, the horns to sweep around the flanks, the loins held back in reserve. It was not modern in the European sense. It was something older and in some ways more intimate, a system designed not to trade fire from afar, but to reach into a line of men and tear its heart out with muscle, steel, and nerve. At the center of the British advance rode Lieutenant General Lord Chelmsford, a man whose confidence was greater than his caution. He believed the Zulu would avoid a major clash or scatter under pressure. So when his central column camped beneath Isandlwana, a dark hill rising from the plain like a crouched beast, he did not fortify it properly. There were wagons, but no defensive laager. There were supplies, but no serious trench lines cut into the earth. The camp sprawled across the ground in a broad, exposed arc. Men slept, ate, joked, cleaned rifles, and waited under a sky so wide it made caution feel almost unnecessary. The enemy, they thought, was out there somewhere, but out there was much closer than they imagined. On the morning of January 22nd, Chelmsford took a large portion of his force away from the camp, chasing reports of Zulu movement. He split his strength in hostile country, leaving behind fewer than 2,000 men in and around the camp, including British regulars, colonial volunteers, artillerymen, and African auxiliaries. Command fell into uncertain hands between Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pauline, a competent administrator but no hardened battlefield improviser, and Colonel Anthony Durnford, aggressive, energetic, and arriving later with mounted men. What should have been one firm command became something blurred. Orders overlapped. Assumptions hardened into fatal delays. Beyond the ridges, hidden in folds of ground and long grass, the main Zulu army waited. Nearly 20,000 warriors had been lying concealed in a ravine and valley system not far from the British camp, under commanders prepared for a decisive strike. They had not been discovered by British intelligence because the British did not truly believe such a force could gather so near without being found. Then mounted patrols pushed too far. A few riders crested the wrong rise. Suddenly, the earth below them seemed alive with bodies. Men stood, shields lifted, spears flashed. What had been hidden became a moving continent of war. The Zulu army rose with astonishing speed. War cries cut through the morning. Regiments surged forward, black and white shields glinting, feathered headdresses trembling in the heat, bare feet pounding dust from the hard plain. Officers in the camp watched the horizon darken with human movement. The alarm spread from tent to gun line to supply wagons. Bugles sounded. Men ran for ammunition, for companies, for formation. This was the moment imperial confidence began to crack, because the enemy was not drifting in fragments. It was arriving as a single terrible intention. British troops deployed into a long firing line well out from the camp. At first, the rifles did what rifles do. Zulu warriors fell in clusters. The artillery opened, shells bursting among dense bodies, throwing dirt and flesh into the air. Martini Henry fire rolled across the plain in hard mechanical crashes, and for a time it must have seemed possible that modern firepower would restore the old story. But the Zulu advance did not collapse. It bent, adjusted, absorbed death, and kept coming. The chest pressed forward, the horns began to curl outward. Here, the shape of the disaster became visible. The British line was too extended, stretched thin across too much ground, trying to cover a camp that had never been made ready for siege. Ammunition had to travel from the rear over chaos and distance. Command decisions came late or collided with one another. Durnford's men, pushed out on the flank, fought fiercely but gave ground as they were enveloped. As companies shifted and retreated, gaps opened. Once gaps open against an enemy built for encirclement, time becomes a weapon in the other man's hand. The horns of the buffalo closed. From the British right and left, Zulu regiments swept wider, then inward, their movement faster than men in heavy equipment could easily answer. Dust clouds thickened, orders vanished in noise, rifle volleys lost their rhythm. Some British soldiers were still firing with brutal discipline, kneeling and reloading amid the dead, while others were already falling back toward the tents. The camp behind them was no fortress now. It was a trap filled with wagons, animals, servants, boxes, panic, and the helpless geometry of collapse. Then came the moment every empire fears and almost never admits, the moment when its soldiers understand that the line will not hold. The Zulu charge hit at close range. Spears drove into men trying to reload. Rifle butts swung like clubs. Bayonets flashed in desperate arcs. Horses screamed. Oxen stampeded. Tents collapsed in the frenzy. Across the plain beneath Isandlwana, British units began to break into fragments, each one fighting its own last stand, with no larger shape left to save it. Some tried to rally around the colors. Some formed knots of resistance among wagons and rocks. Some ran for the Buffalo River, chased by warriors who had crossed miles of killing ground to reach the point where fear finally smells strongest. The slaughter became intimate, not the distant arithmetic of artillery, but breath, blood, and hands. By afternoon, the camp was gone. What had stood that morning as a symbol of imperial order had become a torn landscape of bodies, shattered crates, dead horses, and smoke drifting beneath the silent gaze of the mountain. More than 1,000 British and colonial troops lay dead, along with hundreds of African allies. Zulu losses were also terrible, measured in the thousands, but the field belonged to them. They had done what Europe's greatest empire had not thought possible. They had destroyed a British force in open battle. And before the news even reached London, Before newspapers shaped the shock into headlines and fury, the meaning of the day was already sinking into the soil of Zululand. Isandlwana was not just a victory. It was an event so violent that it cracked the story Britain told about itself. On that plain, men armed with spears and courage had broken disciplined ranks, torn through firepower, and shown that empire was still made of flesh. When the survivors staggered away from Isandlwana, they carried more than wounds. They carried proof that a people the empire had dismissed as doomed could still smash imperial certainty in a single afternoon. Across Natal, rumor moved faster than horses. Small garrisons listened for distant war cries. Civilians imagined the frontier collapsing in fire. Officers who had spoken of Zululand as a problem to be managed now spoke of it as a threat that had to be crushed before the shock turned into contagion. The greatest danger to empire was not only defeat, it was the idea that defeat was possible. For Cetshwayo, the victory was magnificent and terrible at once. He had not wanted a war of extermination. He had wanted his kingdom left alone. Even now, after the destruction of the British camp, the Zulu king understood something many of his enemies did not. One victory against a wounded empire could bring not caution, but vengeance. His commanders had broken an invading column and stunned the British world, but they had also awakened a harder kind of enemy, one humiliated before its own myths. There are victories that open a road. There are others that ring a bell the other side cannot ignore. Isandlwana rang that bell across an empire. Some of the Zulu force moved on the same day against the mission station at Rorke's Drift, where a tiny British garrison held behind mealie bags, biscuit boxes, and improvised barricades. There, the story ran in the opposite direction. A few hundred defenders survived repeated assaults and turned the station into a legend of defiance. Britain clung to that story because it was useful, because nations in shock reach instinctively for something that looks like recovery. But Rorke's Drift did not erase Isandlwana. It stood beside it like a torch lit next to a grave. One defended outpost could not hide the shattered camp beneath the mountain. When the news reached Britain, it landed like a blow to the face. The empire that ruled seas, markets, and continents had seen one of its field forces overwhelmed by an African kingdom the public had barely understood. Newspapers filled with disbelief, anger, and calls for retribution. Questions spread through parliament and military circles. How had a camp been left exposed? Why had forces been divided? Why had the enemy been underestimated so completely? Behind every practical question was a deeper humiliation. The British had not merely lost, they had been caught acting like men who thought the result had already been written. Lord Chelmsford, whose misjudgments had helped shape the disaster, moved quickly to save both military position and reputation. Reinforcements flowed in, supplies increased, British planning hardened. What had begun as an invasion meant to force compliance now became a campaign driven by wounded prestige. The empire could accept blood. It could not accept ridicule. If Isandlwana had cracked the myth of British invincibility, the response would be to bury that crack beneath more troops, more guns, and a scale of violence great enough to restore the old illusion. The Zulu kingdom still had courage, still had regiments, still had men prepared to die in the old formations beneath the king's authority. But now it faced an enemy that had adjusted. British columns became more cautious. Camps were fortified. Supply arrangements improved. Cavalry, infantry, artillery, and Gatling guns were used with greater coordination. The empire had learned the shape of the danger and answered it in the way empires usually do, by bringing more weight, more metal, and less restraint. Once the British stopped offering the easy mistake of Isandlwana, the war changed from a dramatic upset into something darker and more predictable. The Zulu could still fight brilliantly. They could no longer rely on the enemy to present its throat. The months that followed were filled with marches, skirmishes, burnings, and the grinding pressure of a kingdom being tightened in a foreign fist. Homesteads were threatened. Crops were destroyed. Communities were shaken by the sheer persistence of the British return. This is how conquest often works after the famous battle is over. Not only with banners and decisive clashes, but with attrition, exhaustion, and the slow destruction of a people's ability to stand together for one more season. The glory of victory fades quickly when the enemy has more ships, more ammunition, and more time. Then came Ulundi. On July 4th, 1879, the British advanced on the Zulu royal capital in a tight square formation, each face bristling with riflemen and artillery. It was the opposite of Isandlwana in almost every way. This time there would be no sprawling camp, no scattered lines stretched too thin, no confidence without protection. The British came ready. The Zulu attacked with immense courage, rushing forward in great waves with the old ferocity, trying once more to close the distance and turn modern war into human combat. But discipline, concentrated fire, and improved tactical preparation cut them down. Shells burst. Rifle volleys tore lanes through charging bodies. Machine fire added a new, cold rhythm to the killing. Men who had once shattered a British army now fell in rows before a British formation determined never again to be surprised. Ulundi was not just a battle. It was an answer, an empire answering insult with annihilation. The Zulu army fought, but it could not break the square. When the fighting ended, the royal kraal at Ulundi was burned. Smoke climbed into the sky above the heart of the Zulu kingdom. What Isandlwana had proven about courage and tactical brilliance could not overcome what industrial empire could do once it abandoned carelessness and committed fully to destruction. Cetshwayo became a fugitive king in the ruins of the world he had tried to preserve. Eventually, he was captured and sent into exile. The British dismantled the Zulu kingdom, dividing it into rival chiefdoms and leaving behind fragmentation where once there had been a centralized state. The victory at Isandlwana, so thunderous, so unforgettable, had not saved Zululand. In one of history's cruelest turns, it had helped ensure that Britain would never again underestimate the kingdom and would therefore return with greater force until the kingdom was broken. The most glorious day of Zulu resistance became the opening chapter of their political destruction. And yet history cannot be reduced to the empire's ending alone. Isandlwana still stands because it revealed something permanent beneath uniforms, flags, and propaganda. It showed that power can become blind inside its own story. It showed that contempt is one of the deadliest weaknesses a military can carry. It showed that courage, discipline, and tactical intelligence are not inventions of industrial states and never belong to Europe alone. On that field, the Zulu army did not merely win a battle. It forced the British Empire to look into a mirror it had spent generations avoiding. That is why the day still echoes. Not because the Zulu kingdom survived, because it did not. Not because the British myth remained broken forever, because empire is skilled at repairing its own legends. It echoes because for a few brutal hours beneath a South African hill, history stripped away the comforting lies. The rifles were real. The empire was real. The discipline, the logistics, the ambition, the violence, all of it was real. But so were the men rushing through gunfire with shields in their hands and the will to destroy an army that believed them lesser. That reality is too powerful to bury. It lives longer than excuses. War does this again and again. It reveals that power is never as solid as it pretends to be, and that pride often walks into battle already wounded by its own illusions. Empires speak the language of permanence, as if steel, wealth, and banners can hold back time. But memory is cruel to the mighty. It remembers the moment they bled. It remembers the day certainty broke. And sometimes the most unforgettable victories are also the most tragic, because they blaze so brightly only to illuminate the darkness rushing in behind them. The Zulu did not save their kingdom at Isandlwana, but they shattered a myth, and that matters. They proved that the world was not arranged as neatly as imperial maps suggested. They forced one of the most powerful states on earth to pay in blood for its arrogance. In that sense, the dead beneath the mountains still speak. They speak of valor without romance, of resistance without guarantee, of glory that cannot stop ruin. and of the terrible price nations pay when pride mistakes itself for destiny. Thank you for watching. If this story stayed with you, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, because memory survives when people choose to carry it forward. Stay curious, stay with us, and until the next journey.